All right? Hey, what is this whole section in Ephesians about, right? All the way from Ephesians 5:21 down through 6:9, it all revolves around that one verb. If you look at verse 21, it revolves around this one verb which says submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. The whole rest of this section, from 5:22 all the way through 6:9, is about what that looks like. What does it look like to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ? And if you remember, we've been kind of using this illustration, this picture of what that word submit means. That word submit means basically to order ourselves, to put ourselves, get ourselves in the right order underneath an authority. And I've been using this illustration of that like team building game that sometimes gets played, right, at a an office thing, or maybe you've done it at school where you get everybody in a room, you get two teams, and you say, get in order. Everybody got to line up in alphabetical order by birth date. Ready, go. And then it's mass chaos. And everybody's got to figure out, okay, where is my spot? Where is my place in this line? And get themselves in the right order. And the reason we've been using that illustration, even as we've been talking about husbands and wives, and now we're talking about children and parents, and we're going to be talking about the kind of what for us is sort of like workplace dynamics in the next passage. The thing I like about that picture, the illustration of that game, is that in that line, get yourselves in order by birth date from January to December, there is no front of that line. There is no better place in that line. There's no advantage to being closer to this end of the line or that end of the line. It's just, where is your place in line? The best place to be in line is your place, is the right place. And so this whole section is about us in the church finding our place. Where is our place in God's created order? Where is our place in line? And the best place for us to be is in our place for God's glory. As we get to this section today, looking at children and parents, it's really especially important for us to be in the right place in line, because guess what? We're actually passing something down the line. We're passing something down the line. We're passing truth and the blessing that comes with that truth down the line. You imagine like a bucket brigade, right? And then there's you're passing something down, and what if you turn and the person next to you isn't there? They're not in their position in line to receive that. Or if you're standing here and you're waiting, but there's nobody ahead of you to pass it on. When it comes to what we see in terms of the roles of parents and children, it is essential that we be in our right place in line. It is essential, parents, for you to be in your right place in line, in the right order in line, so that you are in position to pass something along, to pass something down the line to your kids. And kids, the few of you that are left in the room, I'm gonna talk to you, I'm gonna address you very directly. Kids, it's essential for you to be in your place in the line so that you are ready to receive something wonderful and important. So that's what we want to look at today as we dive into these two roles, the role of parent and the role of a child. And what we're gonna see today is there's one command and three reasons. One command and three reasons to help children be in their right place in line. Okay? So Paul starts this section. Ephesians 6, 1 through 4. He starts it talking to the children. And I want to call that out really right away. I want you to notice that Paul directly addresses children. This is a command. The subject of the command is children. So Paul is talking to the children directly. But in order to understand this passage, really to understand all of the dynamics of this passage, we have to understand, who does Paul have in mind when he says children? When he addresses children, who is he thinking of? The word he uses here for children doesn't actually really give us a ton of help. There's at least 6 words that Paul could have used for children. 4 of those 6 words would have given us an idea of the age of the children, okay? 4 of those 6 words that he could have used would specify somewhat the age, whether very young children or younger children. But the word that he actually does use does not specify age. This word is just about the relationship between parent and child. And so we speak this way in English too, right? For those of you who have adult children, if I ask you, do you have any children? You don't say, no, I don't have any children, they're all grown. No, you understand that what I'm asking is, do you have people who are related to you in that way, that you are their parent, they are your child, and so you would answer the question. So yeah, I have 3 kids. One's 24, one's 32, and one's 28, right? You would understand that. Same kind of idea with this word. It's a word that doesn't really have an age range attached to it. So the word itself doesn't help us in that way, but the context does. The context gives us some upper boundaries, some upper limits to really help define who and what Paul has in mind in this passage. And first of all, if you look back at the section that we just came out of, talking about husband and wife, right? Paul just quoted from Genesis 2:24. Genesis 2:24 says, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be united, hold fast to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." So Paul has just got done talking about that, and clearly he would see marriage as kind of this bright line, this dividing line in the parent-child relationship, where now he's just given all of this responsibility, all this headship authority to a husband apart from his parents. So that kind of helps us provide an upper boundary here. When he's talking about children here, he doesn't have in mind the people who he was just talking about. Husband and wife, a married couple, even though they still may have parents. Okay? And then in verse 4, if you look, he says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children," same word, "to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." And so we would assume that in this whole section, Paul has the same dynamics in mind. So whoever he's thinking of here, when he says children, that's who he's thinking of here. That would stand to reason. And so down here he's saying, fathers, what are you doing with your children? You're bringing them up. That's the kind of children he has in mind here. Children who are being brought up. Children who are being raised. So Paul has in mind, when he says children, he's thinking of children who are in the process of being raised. And when they're done being raised, they are no longer children in the sense of this command. I just think that's just kind of a helpful marker for kids, for parents to think about, actually. To think, okay, where does that relationship change as far as the dynamics, the situation that Paul is really addressing here? You look at your kids and say, am I still raising them? Yes. Then this command applies. They still need to obey. If you're done raising them, then that's not actually the dynamics that Paul has in mind here. He's thinking about the dynamics inside the household with children that are being reared, being raised, being brought up. Okay? It doesn't mean there isn't other application for this, but I do think Paul is pretty laser focused in terms of what he's addressing. And that's the situation. All right? But I do want to point this out. I want to point out the fact that Paul directly addresses the children. He's addressing children apparently from the age where they can understand what he's saying, understand what he's talking about, all the way up to the age where they are done being raised. He is directly talking to them. And I just think that is really worth noting, because where would this letter have been read? Where would this letter have been presented? The expectation, what we understand, is that this would have been read in the church meeting, in the worship service, the gathering of the local church. And so if Paul, he writes to children and he expects them to receive this, then Paul expected the children to be there present in the gathering, in the meeting of the local church. And I think there's a lot of potential implications of this actually when we think about kids. But I just wanted to baseline remind you that as a church and as a leadership, parents, we want to encourage you to teach your children how to be in the worship service. We want to encourage you to have your kids be in the worship service. Now look, we have Sunday school, we have kids class going on. We're actually in the process of kind of revamping our curriculum for kids class to be even more intentional about how we can be teaching children the gospel, how we can be coming alongside you parents and families in training your children. So we have that, and that's good. I think it's important for kids to do that, but I also think it's important for kids to be in here. On many levels, by the way. I think there's just so much good that comes from training your children how to be and what it means, what it looks like to be in the worship service. And so we just want to encourage you in that, parents, to set aside some time, set aside Sundays, and really at this point, once a month, we don't have, at least elementary, sometimes with elementary and preschool. Take that opportunity. Train your kids, to teach them to be in here, to listen to a sermon. If that's daunting for you, if that's like, man, like I dread that Sunday, go find somebody who has raised up their kids and ask them, hey, how did you handle that? What did you do for that? And they might be like, yeah, we didn't really do that. That's fine. Go see if you can find somebody else. Go try to find somebody, if that's daunting for you, intimidating for you. Let the generations do their work in this church, and we can all learn how to do this well. Because I do think that's the implication of this. Paul expected to be able to have this read in the worship service, and for children to be directly addressed. Okay? So, what does he tell the children? What does he tell the children? What's his command to the children? So obey your parents. We have a few kids in here, so kids, if you're in here, I'm going to address you directly, but I'm also going to unpack this for you parents. What are the implications of this for parenting? He tells the children, obey your parents. That word for obey is the word in Greek hear or listen with the prefix that means under. So it's the word hear or listen with the prefix meaning under. Now look, quick Bible study lesson, okay? Just quick, how do we study the Bible? A lot of times you'll hear pastors, or you'll read stuff like that. So this word is a combination of this word, and this word means this, and this word means this. So that's the picture of this word. We got to be really careful with that, actually, okay? Because when we do a word study, when you start clicking on words in Blue Letter Bible or Bible Gateway or whatever little app you have, when you start clicking on words and start trying to pick them apart, what's our goal? Our goal when we do that is to think about, what did the original audience, what would the original reader have thought about when they read this word? Our goal is not to go and say, okay, here's the whole history of this word, and here's the different parts of this word, and this part means this. No. What did the original reader think when they read that word? Example, the word airplane. Airplane has a very, very interesting history, very interesting etymology. Okay, airplane comes from a French word that's derived from either a Greek word and a Latin word, or maybe two Greek words that basically mean air and a flat surface. Okay? So you go back to an airplane is a vehicle that travels through the air as if it were moving on a flat surface. Is that what you think when you hear the word airplane? No, you as someone in 21st century and a native English speaker, you don't think at all about the history of that word or the roots of that word. None of that comes into your mind. It's not helpful for you at all even to break that down and say like, oh yeah, that helps me understand what an airplane is. No, you understand what an airplane is because when I say airplane, you picture an airplane. You picture the object itself, right? So that's a little Bible study detour. What are we actually looking for when we click on a word? We're not looking for, these two parts mean this, and the word is basically the sum of its parts. Not necessarily. What did the original audience, what would they have thought about? This word, going back to this word for obey. Okay, this word for obey, like I said, the word listen and the prefix under. Now this is the normal garden variety word for obey. So I don't want to make too much out of this, but I think in this case we can look at this and think about what is the concept of obedience that the original audience would have had. And here's what I find interesting, because I think this is lost in English. I think the concept of obedience, probably communicated by this word, is maybe slightly different than ours in English. When I say obey in English, you think do. Do the action. But baked into the normal Greek word for obedience is the word listen. Listen. And actually, in the Old Testament, that's even more true. The word that, you see the word obey in the Old Testament, 9 times out of 10, it literally is just the word listen. Hear. So when we think about obedience, we just think, just do the action. Do what I say. But in their concept of obedience, what's baked into that is that you're not just doing, you're listening. And parents, I think that's helpful to think about. You don't just want your kids to do. That's not your end game. You want them to listen. You want them to listen to you. You want them to listen to loving authority in such a way where they say, yes, I will now go do that because I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm trusting you. That's actually what we're aiming for, not just doing. And that's going to come up again here in a minute, okay? So we don't just want our kids to do. We want our kids to do because they've listened, because they're listening to us. At the end of the day, they do need to do. They do need to do the things, right? It's not like obedience is not to say, okay, yeah, I heard you and I disagree and I'm going to go do something else. That's not obedience, right? It's listening in order to do. Listening with a heart that says, I want to hear and understand so that now I can go out and do. So at the end of the day, they need to do what they are told. Children need to do what they are told. Children must obey. They are commanded by God to obey. And look, this is not the norm. Okay, this is not the norm in our culture, right? I'm not big on like quoting stats and stuff, right? I don't go read all the stats and this is trend since the 90s and blah blah blah. If you're into that, it's great. But if I just go to the park, I don't need stats to tell me what's going on in our culture. Right? You go to the park and you watch people parent, and you see what happens, and you see that, a mom goes and goes to her toddler and says, all right, do this now. And the toddler says, no. And the mom says, oh, okay, well, I guess we won't do that. Maybe we'll do this. And it's just that's the norm. That's the norm in our culture when it comes to parenting. That kids get to call the shots, that kids get to run the show, and there really is no recourse for a parent. But folks, that's not the picture that the Bible paints here. Children must obey. They are commanded to obey. And children must be taught that no is not an option when you have issued a command, parents. When you have issued a command, no is not an option. Now look, let's be honest. Parenting like that can be extremely inconvenient and extremely embarrassing too. Okay? Now, ultimately, the hope is that it actually turns out to be easier as you've trained your children. Now they do listen. But along the way, man, there are a lot of really, really inconvenient and potentially embarrassing moments when it would just be way easier to not go to the mat on this one. And just let your kid disobey. Let them not do what you said. I heard a pastor tell a story once where a dad basically brought his young son up to the front of the church after the service. Came up to ask a question or something, and the son was there, and the dad says to his son, he issues a command to his son and says, tell Pastor so-and-so good morning. And the kid doesn't do it. Instead, he kind of, shrinks back and goes and hides behind the dad. And the dad turns to the pastor and says, oh, sorry, he's just shy. As if that is going to excuse the fact that you just issued a command, he didn't do it, he didn't listen to you. And he seemed to be just expecting the pastor to kind of brush that off and say, oh yeah, I understand, it's okay. But instead the pastor said, I can wait. And those are the kind of moments that we run into when we are going to insist on obedience. But that's what we need to do. That's what we need, and they're not convenient and they're not particularly fun. But in those moments to say, okay, we're going to work this through right now, even if it takes a long time. Because, child, you must obey. You are commanded to obey. This isn't optional. Now, there's wisdom in there, right? Parents, and there's wisdom in there, and there's lots of different ways to talk to your kid, and you know this as a parent. There's wisdom in saying, I could issue a command, but maybe actually now's not the time to issue a command. Because as soon as I issue a command, now it becomes a matter of obedience. And so maybe I actually do give an option right now because I know this is not setting up my child for success, right? There's wisdom in that. There's all kinds of nuance in that. But at the end of the day, children must be taught to obey. When you issue a command, now it's a matter of obedience, and we need to insist on that obedience. And there's lots of ways that we need to teach children to obey. There's lots of things involved there. And we will do, we're going to start up adult Sunday school on Sunday mornings, and we will do 4 weeks, 6 weeks on parenting. We will do a stretch of that on parenting, and we will get into all the nitty-gritty of parenting. But this is not an exhaustive topical sermon on parenting. This is a sermon. What is Paul doing here in Ephesians 6, 1 through 3? That's what we're looking at. And so the question is, how does Paul handle this? How does Paul handle it here? There's lots of other things involved in parenting, but what does Paul do here, and what can we learn? Because guess what? Paul has just issued a command to children. You issue commands to your children. Paul just issued a command to children. And so what does Paul do? What does Paul do in order to teach children, to help children to obey the command that he just gave? And ultimately, what's Paul going to do? Paul's going to tell them why. Paul issues a command to children, and then he tells them why they should obey. And actually, it doesn't end here in verse 1. Here's structurally what I think is going on in verses 1 through 3. Right? This is the direct reason. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. Why? Because this is right. And then here, verses 2 and 3, Paul brings in this Old Testament quotation, right? He's probably quoting from the Greek text of Exodus 20 and the Ten Commandments. But basically, here's what I think is doing. A lot of times, I think we look at this and we separate these into two commands: obey and honor. Like Paul is giving two commands here. I don't think that's the case. I think this is Paul's command. Obey. Children, obey your parents. And then here in verses 2 and 3, now Paul is bringing in an Old Testament quotation to support his reasoning. It's like if you took, you took like a 8th grade English class, right? And they taught you to write an essay in 8th grade English. This is at least what they did for me. They said, okay, here's what you're gonna you gotta prove something. Maybe they made you read some book that you didn't understand, and now you gotta write an essay on it and say some really profound things, right? So what you do is you say, okay, here's my statement about this book, and now I'm gonna bring in a quote from the book in order to support the statement, to prove the statement that I just made. That's basically what I think Paul is doing here. He's not issuing a separate command. This is a command. This stands on its own in the Old Testament, right? This is the 5th commandment. It stands on its own. But Paul is using this basically to support or prove this assertion, the last part of verse 6. Children, it is right for you to obey your parents. Let me prove it to you. 5th commandment. That's structurally what I think is going on. That's what I think Paul's logic is here. And I just find this so instructive. I find this so good. Because basically what we have here, from here all the way down to the end of verse 3, is Paul reasoning with children. We have Paul's example of how he reasons with children. And look, there need, like I said, there are all kinds of other things that need to happen in parenting, okay? There needs to be consistent, loving discipline. We'll come to that a little bit more in verse 4. But there is a big place, parents, for you to reason with your children, for you to talk with them and explain to them and help them understand why they should obey. Maybe sometimes not in the moment, right? Maybe in the moment it's like, no, like you need to obey. But you've got to prepare them for that moment by reasoning with them and helping them understand why. Why obedience? Why should I listen to you? Some people will object to that. Some people object to that. I've had people object to that and say, no, my kid doesn't need to understand why. They just need to do it. They just need to do what I say. You know what I call that? I call that Nike parenting. What's the slogan of Nike? Just do it. That's Nike parenting. Here's the deal. Paul's not employing Nike parenting here. You know who else doesn't employ Nike parenting? God. God is not a Nike parent. If we take which we should, shouldn't we all, parents in the room, shouldn't we just say, I just want to parent like God? If I could just parent my kids the way God as a father parents me, and what better goal can we have than that? So we take our cues from how does God treat us? How does God treat us? How does God deal with us? And look at this book. There's my pencil. Folks, this is a big book. You know what would make it a lot shorter? Just take out all of the explanations and all of the reasons and just leave the commands, and we can really shorten this thing down. But that's not what God gave us, right? God goes to great, great lengths. Not just to say, hey, do that, just do it. But to explain to us why. And not just why, like, here's why you should do it because this is going to happen. No, but do it because this is who I am. And you can trust me when I say, do it. That's how God deals with us. You just think about, I'll just give you a few explanations, right, of how God expects his children to think while they're obeying. Exodus 20, the 10 Commandments. You might look at the 10 Commandments and say, that's the 10 Commandments is a clear example. God's like, do it, do it, do it, do it, do it. Actually, no. Because what do the 10 Commandments start with? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. God starts the 10 Commandments actually with the explanation of why they should listen to him. I'm your God who just rescued you out of Egypt. I'm your God who just parted the Red Sea and caused you to walk across on dry ground and drowned all of Pharaoh's armies. I'm the God who heard your cries from your oppression. And I came and acted with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and I have rescued you. I have delivered you. So on the one hand, I have authority over you. So you need to listen to me. But on the other hand, man, why wouldn't you trust the God who had just done all of that and do what he says? The 10 Commandments is actually, the intro to the 10 Commandments is God giving the reason why Israel should listen. Okay? Let me give you some other examples. You think about some of my favorite verses, some of the verses that we quote all the time. James 1, Romans 5, James 1, what does it say, right? Consider it all joy, my brothers, when you encounter various trials. Period. Just do it. Right? No. Consider it all joy. That's a command. Okay, so there's a command when you encounter various trials. Why should you consider it all joy? Knowing, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and endurance produces proven character, and proven character produces hope. And actually, I just mixed that up with Romans 5, but it's basically it's the same thing. Hope does not disappoint. That's Romans 5, because the love of God has been poured out into our hearts through the Spirit that he has given us. Okay? So God doesn't just say, hey, consider it joy, period, hard stop, just do it. No, he says, consider it joy. Why? Because of what you know. Because of what I've told you about how trials work, how suffering works. Here's why you should obey this command, to consider it all joy, because of what you know. The whole book of Ephesians is built around that same structure, actually, right? Everything we're studying in Ephesians. What does Paul do? Does Paul start and say, all right, here's your list of commands, now just go do it? No. Paul starts with 3 chapters without a single command. 3 chapters without a single command telling us what? The gospel. Here is all that God has done for you in the person of Jesus Christ. Here is the wonderful things that God has done. And then starting in chapter 4, now go do all of this stuff. Go live this way in obedience. But why? Because of chapters 1 through 3. Folks, that's God's pattern as a parent. God's pattern as a parent is to really, really go to great lengths to have his children understand why. And that's essentially what Paul is doing here. This is a good example from Paul of what it looks like to say, okay, son, daughter, I'm going to explain to you why you need to obey. And ultimately, again, structurally, if this is 2 and 3 are really Paul supporting this assertion, then we end up with 3 reasons here that Paul gives. 3 reasons Paul gives kids. 1, 2, 3, in verse 3. The first is this. Obey your parents, kids. Why? Because it's right. Because it's right. And that word right doesn't mean anything special. It just means right. It's the right thing to do. The righteous thing to do in terms of God's standard. I think it's really interesting that's when Paul lays the ground and says, kids, why? Right off the bat, you obey your parents. That's where he starts. He starts with, kids, you need to do it because it's righteous, because it's right in God's moral standard. I think that's instructive for us. When you go to reason with your kids, parents, where do you start with them? Because there's lots of different places that you could start. And I think oftentimes I'm tempted to start with the practical side. Paul actually gets to that later, but that's not where he starts. I'm tempted to start with, hey, you need to obey because if you don't, then this, and this is going to happen. But look, if you do obey, then this is going to happen. And how good is that going to be? So that's where I am naturally inclined to start in showing a child, hey, here's the wisdom of obedience. But Paul actually doesn't start there. He just starts with, no, the fundamental root reason that you need to obey is because it's right. It's just good to take our cue there. Like, start there in your reasoning with kids. Because ultimately, doing what's right is ultimately not about what happens after, right? We do what's right even if it leads to hard things. We obey God even if it leads to difficult things. And so we can't have that be the ground of obedience to say, hey, obey and good things will happen, disobey bad things. That can't be the ground of obedience. Because we've got to obey no matter what happens as a result. Children need to learn that. So you start in your reasoning where Paul does. This is right. It is right to obey. Now I think the support that he gives here is to defend that. Why is it right? Why is it right for children to obey? And so the first support he gives here is basically this. He's proving that it's right. And so he quotes from the Old Testament, he quotes from Exodus and says, it's right because God said so. It's right because God said so. God said this. This is the fifth commandment. Honor your father and mother. And so kids, it's right for you to obey your parents because God said so. This is God's command. And again, parents, thinking about how you reason, how you explain to your kids why to obey. How often do we veer towards you obey because I said so? The only reason your kids need to do what you say is because God said so. Your authority is a derivative authority. And so we say, okay, you obey because it's right. Why is it right? It's right because God said to do it. God commands you to do this. And you start reasoning with a child that way and working them through that from a very, very early age. I just encourage you, aim high. Just reason like this with kids when they can barely understand what you're saying. And just make this the pattern of how you talk about obedience. Okay, so it's right. It's right because God said so. And again, this word, there's a lot of other applications of this. If I was preaching Exodus 20, if I was preaching the fifth commandment, we would talk about a lot of other things, because this word honor is actually not the exact same word as obey, right? It's different. It means to value, to treasure, okay? And so in Exodus 20, we would dive into all of the implications of that for grown children. Children who are done being raised, still need to honor. That's Exodus 20. Still have a responsibility to their parents. But here, the way I think Paul is using this is to defend his assertion to children who are in the process of being raised, okay? So, forgive me for not getting into all the implications. Try to stay focused on what Paul's actually after here. So it's right. Why? God said so. Fifth commandment. And then reason number 3, now he does go practical. And again, you just think about Paul, Paul is saying this, and he's saying verses 2 and 3 to children. He's addressing this to the children, to reason with them, to convince them that obedience is right, it's good. And he does go practical, and he says, hey, kids, this commandment, the commandment to honor your parents, to obey your parents, guys, this is a special commandment. Kids, look at this commandment. This is the first commandment with a promise. Can you just imagine the Apostle Paul getting down on one knee and talking to a kid and saying, this command to obey your parents, this is a special one. God gave a promise with this commandment. That's what he's doing there with this. He's motivating kids. It's it's good to obey. And what is the promise? That it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. So, obey because it's right. Obey, it's right because God said so. And yeah, you know what? Obey because generally it goes well when you obey. It's wise to obey because it generally goes well when you obey. Now, you think about the original context of this, all right? Children, when children obey your parents, it generally, proverbially, goes well in this life. Not always, right? Not always. There's exceptions. But proverbially, You think about a kid who learns to listen to their parents, who respects their parents, who has that kind of relationship with their parents, where they have learned to do what their parents say in this way. Generally, is that kid going to grow up with the kind of attitude that's going to allow them to successfully navigate the world? I'd say generally yes. Generally yes. And that would have been true in the original context of this. In the fifth commandment, when the promise is issued, they would say, yeah, you obey your parents, kid, in ancient Israel, and it's going to go way better for you than if you don't. And on a very practical level, remember in the law, there's commands for disobedient children about what to do with disobedient children. If you have a son in the law, a child in the law who is very disrespectful to his parents, or fights back or strikes his parents, that child can be put to death. And so, yeah, obey your parents. It's going to go better for you in life. Like, they're not going to take you out and stone you for disobeying your parents. Real practical. But we would say, just in general, proverbially, things are going to go better. Generally in life, if you learn this kind of obedience and respect as a child. But there's another dimension to this too, okay? We read Deuteronomy 6. And hopefully you heard the similarities between Deuteronomy 6 and the promise that's given. Deuteronomy 6 says, you're going to teach these things to your children. You can turn over there. I'll turn over there too. Right? He says, this is the commandment, the rules and the statutes the Lord your God has commanded me to teach to you, that you may do them in the land that you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be long. Hear therefore, Israel, be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, right? That you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you in a land flowing with milk and honey. What is that promise? That promise is part of the covenant. The promise is part of the Mosaic covenant. And the Mosaic covenant basically says this: look, you follow God, you obey God, and things are gonna be awesome. You're gonna live in the land that God is giving you. And it's going to be prosperous, it's going to be flowing with milk and honey. And God is going to be your God, and you are going to be his people, and there's going to be this wonderful relationship between Israel, the nation, and God. That's what's going on with this promise. This promise is actually what the Old Testament is saying with the promise. It's not magic. It's not like, hey, just obey your parents and God will look and say, okay, cool, I'm just going to give you a long life. No. It's Israelite child in the Old Testament. Here's the assumption. Your parents are doing Deuteronomy 6. They are teaching you the commands and the statutes and the ways of God. They are teaching you to love God and walk according to the covenant. And so, kid, if you obey them in that, then yeah, it's going to be great for you because that's what God promised in the old covenant. Generations of people walking with God according to his commandments and living in the land. That's what this means. That's how this works. When you obey your parents, it's going to go well with you. You're going to live long in the land that the Lord your God has given you. Your parents are passing down spiritual things to you that then cause you to obey and walk with God. Now look, we're not under the old covenant, okay? We don't have that same promise where it's like, hey, God has promised you, kid, you obey your parents in the new covenant era, and you know what? Your parents' little plot of land there, you can live there forever. It's gonna be great, and you're gonna have milk and honey and fig trees and prosperity. No, that's not part of the new covenant. Okay, so we don't have that same promise. But the intention of this is this: that parents, you are getting in position to pass along spiritual things to your children, that they may be blessed. And ultimately, look, we cannot confer salvation upon our kids. On the one hand, we wish we could. On the other hand, I'm so glad that we can't, because the pressure of that would be immense. We cannot confer salvation on our kids, but we can get in position, and we can help them get in position to receive the gospel from us in as clear a picture of who God is as we can give them. And that's really, at the end of the day, what this is about. Teach your children to obey, because that gets them in position to listen to the most important things from you. At the end of the day, folks, this isn't about the dishes getting done. This isn't about the clothes getting picked up. This isn't about the Legos on the floor. All of that is just about kids getting in the right place in line to have the most important truths passed to them by you, that they may live forever. So, we've got to help them get in position. Next week, parents, we're just going to look at how do parents get in position to pass that along. Okay? Let me pray. Father, thank you for the clear instruction in your word. Thank you for just all the implications, all the things that we can learn. Thank you for the example from Paul here of his reasoning with children. There's so many things. God, I pray for the parents in our church, myself included. God, help us. Help us to teach our kids with love and gentleness and kindness, just like you teach us, but with firmness also, and that our kids would get in their place in line, the place of listening, to be able to receive the most precious things. Father, help those who their children are grown, that they have run this part of the race that Paul is talking about. I just pray that there would be much discipleship going on, where parents with younger kids would be able to learn, parents who have walked this road already. And then, Father, for all of us, whether we have kids or not, God, help us to be in prayer and help us to be encouraging one another and holding each other accountable, even like that pastor who didn't let that dad off the hook. That we would just be reminding one another as we're all living together here with kids running around all over the place. That we would all be part of this community, this gospel community, that would pass truth to another generation. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.